présenter Soper. Ça sera rapide comme présentation pour lui laisser le temps de la performance et de la présentation possible, mais quand même quelques mots. Bon, elle est autrice, chanteuse, pianiste. Elle a une considérable. Moi, je vais m'asseoir ici. Et donc, je vais citer quelques titres. Now is Forever, Only the Words Themselves Mean What They Say, or Songs for Nobody, et son opéra Ipsa Dixit, qui lui a valu, entre autres, une nomination pour le prix Pulitzer de musique pour chambre. Elle a été aussi un Guggenheim Fellow. Elle a mis en musique des textes aussi diversifiés que Platon, Freud, Aristote, j'en oublie. Pour résumer un peu la chance que nous avons d'avoir aujourd'hui, je renverrai un article du New Yorker qui est assez récent et qui disait qu'avec Kate Soper, les mots génie et masterpiece et chef-d'œuvre n'étaient pas galvaudés, mais qu'ils méritaient d'être vraiment.
Un peu trop.
C'est de New York oui. Quand même. Hein? C'est pas les fake news. Là. Alors, nous allons pouvoir vous entendre. On est ravis de clore ce colloque avec vous. Donc, j'en profite pour remercier tous les participants, pour remercier d'avoir accepté notre invitation.
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour l'introduction. Merci à Eric pour l'invitation. Chers collègues, je suis heureuse d'être ici pour parler de mon travail. And that concludes the portion of my talk in French. I'm sorry that I can't continue, and I'm also sorry that I couldn't listen to the talks today with more ability and attention. But I do feel like I got some resonances and some interesting follow-up questions. So thank you very much for including me in this really interesting event. I was not familiar with the works of Paul-Zumthor before. Eric wrote me about this conference, but I'm really happy to know about it and to know some of your scholarship too. So I am a composer, performer, and writer, especially concerned with vocal music and with how music interacts with language. And my work over the past several years has involved a lot of medieval and ancient texts, as was said. So I thought I would today demonstrate some of the ways in which I attempt to draw close to these texts through the mists of time, as Thor might say, and to bring them to life for myself and my audiences. I find that in this endeavor, music functions for me as an intermediary, as an interpreter, or a kind of cryptologist, and it's always a very interesting journey for me. And I'll just share some of my thoughts on vocality in general. I thought I would start talking a little bit about this piece, Ipsa Dixit, which I had been working on for many years, but premiered last spring with my ensemble, Wet Ink. I'm going to be showing a lot of videos. Maybe we should put the lights, yeah. So this is a work that, like most of what I do, explores the intersections of language, meaning, and music in many different ways, along with ideas of ensemble virtuosity and extended vocal technique. It's a 90-minute work, uses a very wide range of texts from Wittgenstein to Sarah Teasdale, and 3 of its 6 movements are adaptations of large treatises by Aristotle. I'm just going to talk about the 4th movement, which is a duet for soprano and percussion, and this is an adaptation of Plato's dialogue, The Crito. So just to refresh, I'm sure many of you know, but the Crito takes place in Socrates' prison cell, where he is awaiting execution after his trial. Socrates is visited by his friend Crito, who offers to help him escape into exile. In order to evaluate this proposal, Socrates presents a hypothetical debate between himself, or any citizen who is considering breaking the law, and the personified laws of Athens, who defend their honor and rebut the citizens' arguments. After listening to both sides of the debate, which he has manufactured, Socrates concludes that it would be wrong for him to break the law in this case. He remains in prison and is executed. The Crito is one of the shortest dialogues in the trial and death of Socrates, and it's also very baffling in a way. The arguments of the personified laws, that a city will fall apart if its laws are not upheld, that Socrates owes too much to the laws that have protected him to disobey them now, ring false when compared with the terrible injustice of wrongful execution. In interpreting this piece, my explanation for Socrates' unexpected capitulation comes from a revealing remark he makes to Crito at the conclusion of his staged debate. He tells Crito that the voice of the laws, the voice which he has constructed, rings so strongly in his ears that it drowns out any protests. He compares himself to the Corybantes, mythological dancers who became swept up in ecstatic musical revelry. More than any explanation of social contract, this confession seems to hold the psychological key to the scene. Socrates has effectively done himself in with his own rhetoric by inventing a devil's advocate who overpowers even his own mighty logic. This interpretation can be easily rendered legible with music. After a dreamlike introduction, my setting of the Crito begins with an abridged, updated version of the initial dialogue between Socrates, who is played by the soprano, and Crito, who is played by the percussionist, who talk to each other naturally, as in a play. The effect of spoken versus sung speech and the advantages and pitfalls of each of these modes of expression in art is something that, as a soprano, I am constantly aware of. Speech is informative, natural, unifies performers and audience. Singing is affected, otherworldly, and carries the threat of unintelligibility. In listening to speech, we privilege logos, the content and meaning of words. In listening to singing, we become much more susceptible to phonos, the sound of the words. As Socrates' argument spins out, the proportion of sung to spoken text increases dramatically, while the music from the percussionist increases in intensity, until finally Socrates, in the guise of the laws, is singing with righteous furor the original Greek of the dialogue amidst a roiling sea of cymbals, bells, and drum beats. In the denouement, Socrates, stripped of the clarity of speech for good, sings his defeat while Crito silently assents. So I'm going to play this whole section of this piece, the Crito, about 10 minutes long. And this is a performance from last December. Good morning, Crito.
Good morning, Socrates.
You're here really early, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
What time is it?
Nearly dawn.
I'm surprised the warden let you in this early.
He knows me by now. I am here every day.
Did you just get here, or have you been waiting a while?
Several hours.
Why didn't you just wake me?
I didn't want to disturb you. You're sleeping so peacefully. How can you sleep like that? You're about to be executed.
It would be unseemly for a man my age to resent having to die.
Everyone resents having to die.
That's true. So tell me, why did you come so early?
I've got some really bad news.
What news? The ship's in from Delos?
No, but it's supposed to get in today.
And I must die the following day, right?
That's what the authorities said.
And I don't think that the ship will come in today.
Why not?
I had this dream last night. Guess it's good you didn't wake me.
What dream?
A gloriously beautiful woman, dressed in a white robe, came up to me and said,
What's that supposed to mean?
It means that I will not be executed tomorrow, but 3 days from now.
And Socrates, for the last time, I'm begging you. Let me break you out of here.
Clydo, as always, I can only do what seems to me to be right, regardless of the predicament I find myself. Let's examine the situation together. And if I can't convince you that it would be wrong to break the law by escaping from here, then I'll go with you. Okay?
I guess so.
Okay. Now, suppose that while we were planning to run away from here, or whatever you want to call it, the laws were to appear before us and say, can you deny that by this plot to destroy us, the laws? Do you imagine that our city can survive with its laws have no force? Suppose we then reply, yes, I intend to destroy you because I have been condemned unjustly.
Makes sense to me.
But then suppose the laws continue. Was this our understanding? Or did you not agree to abide by us and to obey our honest ruling? Did we not give you life through the marriage of your parents? Did we not demand your education? I suppose we'd say, I have no complaint against the laws of marriage or of child rearing. Then I guess they'd say, can you now deny you were our child and our servant? Are you not bound to honor and obey us, just as you may not harm your mother and father, so you may not harm the Lord? What do you think, Clydo? Do the laws speak correctly?
I guess so.
Consider this, oh Socrates! The laws would probably continue that by living in this city, you have also chosen to abide by us its laws. And having been accused, your choice was correct. But speak if you have anything to say. In thus interpreting the Credo, I do wonder a little bit now, having done some reading this week, if I have fallen prey to what Zumthor might call the pitfall of applying simplifying analogies to the text, or explaining it by reference to my own myths. I recognize in the Credo a contemporary anxiety about the dangers of political rhetoric, and a personal skepticism about the manipulative power of vocal music. Or at least, I think I recognize these things, but I read this work through a very particular lens, and my setting of the Credo is a rending of a decidedly subjective reading. The next work I would like to talk about also has ancient origins, but operates under a different paradigm entirely. A paradigm in which the fallacy of timelessness that pervades works separated from us by centuries may in fact be appropriate, that of mythology. Here Be Sirens is an opera for 3 sopranos who accompany themselves on a lidless piano about the mythological Homeric sirens. In the epigram to this opera, I quote Foucault from Madness and Civilization. Things themselves become so burdened with attributes, signs, illusions, that they finally lose their own form. Meaning is no longer read in an immediate perception. The figure no longer speaks for itself. Between the knowledge which animates it and the form into which it is transposed, a gap widens. It is free for the dream. If a problem with interpretation of very old texts lies in our inability to perceive a code between the author and his or her culture, a code which has been made inaccessible by time, the freedom offered by myth is that this code does not exist, or perhaps that it requires constant reactivation from each new reader in order to function. The sirens have been in a state of constant reinvention since their creation. I have merely invented 3 more. In Here Be Sirens, they wait on their island for ships to come in as we expect them to do. But these sirens are, like us, caught up in the struggle to identify the origin and significance of the siren mythology. This quest for self-knowledge is mostly undertaken by one particular siren in the opera, Calypso, who turns to collective knowledge to determine whether it might be possible for her to escape the apotheosization which prevents her from being real. Calypso spends the whole opera searching for her species origin, using any scrap of historical evidence she can find. In this clip I'm going to show, she is preoccupied with a potential lead that she has discovered involving a reported feud between the muses and the sirens. And she struggles to build a case for the sirens' superiority despite their homicidal reputation. St. Isidore of Seville says that sirens are depicted with wings and claws because love is a thing that flies and moves. He also said that the myth of the sirens originated in rampant dockside prostitution, which led many a sailor to financial ruin. We are a disease. That's how they all describe us, the weakest and dark. The siren song is something that befalls you. Desire is a catastrophe. Maybe a useful catastrophe. Jacques Lacan says the only thing you can be guilty of is to surrender your desire. It's in book 7 of the seminar, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Once desire is fulfilled, it is by definition no longer desire. That's what eros means, lack, want. Desire is what keeps you alive, because complete satisfaction means death. And in this equation, the sirens provide, an unconsummatable desire, spooling it out and then reeling it in with all the sailors clinging to it, clinging to the life. I mean, they do die, but they die of empathy. A death died in conformity with desire. St. Isidore also contributes the example of the siren serpent, a snake with wings, whose venom is so powerful that death arrives before pain is felt. They wash up dead with big, dopey, hypnotized grins on their faces. They die in the throes of an unbearably pleasurable love. Thanatos and Eros, the sex drive and the death drive. These are the forces governing every living thing, and we offer you a way out through capitulation. We offer you the most pleasurable way possible to end your life. All the muses offer you are ways to make your life worth living. Calypso stymies herself thus at every turn. She insists on a reliance on texts for answers, and despite her occupation, resists the power of music, because, unlike Socrates, she is fully aware of music's power to fatally overwhelm logic and truth. At the outset of the opera, she tries to warn the audience of the danger they are in and to recruit them to her side. This is how it happens. First, you feel it coming. Oars hitting the water, throbbing in the sand. And the sails flutter right before the wind gets sucked out of them. Then it heaves into view. You can see the white water melting away around it like fog in the mirror. That means things stop flowing. Because they can sense us too. All of a sudden, the sea is glass, and the sky is glass, and the light is a prism whose every ray is focused exactly here. Know it, but it's already over, because they're in earshot. And that's when we start in with the singing. What do we sing? Well, whatever you want to hear generally. To be honest, the content is fairly irrelevant. There are two basic components to the logos. Logos is the meaning, is what you're actually saying. The production of logos being, according to Aristotle, the mark of reason, the central feature of intelligence. Whereas phonos is the sound of the voice. The mere sound, the medium through which logos travels, that blankness which makes invitation, which resounds without signification. Phonos is higher than voice, mucous membrane is quite large. I'm insignificant access and obscene reference. Logos function is well meaning the sound of the word is not looking at the word refers to. A treacherous distraction, according to Augustine, the melody which carries the word is that which paralyzes the mind with sensuous. Look at the captain of the male and the right. We're saying from the goddamn phone book. I can't block out my own voice. physiological organ. The sound crawls up from the depths of you and oozes out through the pores of your face and the sockets of your eyes. The sound that doesn't come from you and doesn't belong to you, but is taking you as a surrogate for ritual. Music operates in a unique way in the world of the sirens, and as a composer, I was able to take special advantage of this. All of the music, as seen in this previous clip in Here Be Sirens, is diegetic. That is, it is part of the actual action of the opera. It is really happening. The sirens surely must be able to sing in all styles of music that exist or have ever existed, and writing for them gave me the opportunity to expand my own compositional techniques. I have long been fascinated with medieval polyphonic vocal music, and I imagine many people here are familiar with this music also, which in some instances is unrivaled in complexity even today. Of particular interest to me are the polytextual motets of Guillaume de Machaut, the 13th century poet and musician. Machaut might use two different French texts on seemingly unrelated subjects or with vastly different characters in upper voices and underpin them with a Latin biblical fragment in the lowest voice to create a multidimensional work in which separate and simultaneous music, language, and context all converge in a prism of meaning. My homage to this technique appears during an explication of yet another Origine story, this one involving Persephone. In Ovid's Metamorphosis, the sirens are identified as former handmaidens of Persephone, and they were given wings by Demeter in order to search for their abducted companion. On Polyxo's instigation, the sirens act this story out during the opera, each one singing a verse from the perspective of one of the main parties, Persephone, Hades, and Demeter. But within these verses are coded the syllables of the name Persephone. The verses operate as kind of a clue once they are performed simultaneously. So I'm going to first just play them one at a time. So this is from Persephone's perspective. Next, we hear from Hades' perspective.
The perfect innocence, even in hated fields of us, for death strikes him with tender irony. His temper is very seldom full, and yet for her it's sweet as honey. Her loyal love, he says, all I own needs nothing to your company.
And then from Demeter's perspective.
Her daughters persecuted by these 7 seas, which to her misfortune did not remain unbeaten. A whisper that says, would this poor foe move her to harmony and feeling? Perhaps in her sound, a voice cried through only I need.
When the verse are repeated simultaneously, at first the only result is intelligibility drops as counterpoint emerges. The verses are repeated again, and this time there is musical attention drawn to the syllables of the embedded name. Finally, the extraneous syllables fall away. The details of the story fade, and only its consequences, fatefully stamped into the events from the outset, remain as the sirens lose the pantomime and fly about the stage, calling for Persephone. One more 10-minute clip that I wanted to play, and then a few minutes of talking. I think it's okay until 6:15. Is that what you said? Is that good? Okay. Calypso's investigations take a turn when she realizes that the multivalent nature of her own story means that it cannot be comprehended or even ended by her. Worse, she is ultimately unable to use logos to defend herself in the face of the phonos, in which she, as a siren, must participate. Her authority diminished and unable to resist her nature, she makes a final desperate attempt to escape the realm of pure vocality. So I will play this last clip towards the end. Any text not by me in this clip, there's a long section of Sappho, which is translated by Anne Carson, and then the Latin at the end is by Erasmus.
There's a ship coming. Come on! Ships of men will whiten with their oars, and classic strengthen is the siren lair, until the Pleiades grow dim and cold. Should a vessel carry one who lives to sing of his encounter, what happens then? Unclear. Some say the sirens die at that point, although that's inconsistent with literary evidence. I don't want to do this!
We have to sing something!
Why? Why do you sing to them?
Because I'm in love with them.
Poi faccio portare questo. Neschio, se vieni senti an excursion. I hate and I love. Why do I do this, you might ask? I have no idea. But I feel it happening and it hurts. Gaius Attalus, Army 85. Love goes ever further and further. But when the limit is passed, it turns to hate. Simone Weil. Julia Christina, Revolutions in Poetic Language. The subject of desire lives at the expense of his drives, ever in search of a lacking object. One must do violence to the object of one's desire. When it surrenders, the pleasure is great. The Marquis de Sade. Jean Baudrillard, de la Séduction. Seductress wants to live in an eternal present, despite the field of deception and despair in which she moves. Seduction is a war game, a murder, and a perfect crime, a conspiracy of power, a sacrificial form.
Well, if seduction is sacrificed, then it has to end with a murder, doesn't it? It is an impure seduction that ends in love and pleasure, and is therefore no longer a sacrifice. What's this?
Sappho. You like her, she's out of desire.
I want to sing it.
You can't sing it, it's 95% illegible, like papyrus and smithereens. Sappho's just a jumble of fragments.
I can see some longer parts.
I don't know how that happened.
Well.
What's this?
Sappho. You like her, she's out of desire.
I want to sing it.
You can't sing it, it's 95% illegible, like papyrus and smithereens. Sappho's just a jumble of fragments.
I can see some longer parts.
It's junk! All broken up!
Then let's sing some pieces! Sing to us, the one with violets in her lap, far more sweet sounding than a lyre, bolder than
There's a third component to the voice, in addition to logos and phones. Logos, the language of men.
I bid you sing of advantage, taking up your lyre as mom and law.
Muthos signifies the kind of formula of speech, the way to tell a story, the way to weave a spell, to hex, to cant, to curse.
Eros, the melter of limbs, now
See,
again stirs.
It's dangerous when the sound of the voice separates itself from language in phonos. But the danger of muthos is that it uses language like sound. Logic, meaning all trumped by effect in speech, but it doesn't make sense. There's no covenant between word and meaning. There's nothing real to be referred to. There's only language making a spectacle of itself. Logos is the pursuit of truth through the monster of rationality. But the truths of muthos are little. That is to say, lies.
Their hearts grew cold, they let their wings
You think it's beautiful, but it's empty. It can't teach you anything. It can't help you understand.
messenger of spring.
Don't you want to understand?
With a of love.
Do you just want to be captivated?
These things for my companions I shall now.
No! Ah!
So that's Here Be Sirens. She doesn't make it. So now I just want to talk for a couple of minutes about my current project, which is, as I've mentioned to some of you, an operatic version of the Romance of the Rose. And I thought I would share one more quote from Zumthor that I liked. How can we grasp the ties that bound these old poems, which happen to have come down to us, to culture lost in the mists of time? There is just one piece of firm ground on the shifting sand. We can fall back on the messages themselves, which are so hard to interpret, and yet in which there still vibrates the intensity of what was a desire, an emotion, no doubt, and the perception of a form of beauty. The Romance of the Rose presents many challenges to the aspiring opera adapter. It cannot fit neatly into a contemporary framework like the Credo, nor does it offer the vessel-like openness of myth. The text is crisscrossed with so many references and contradictions, compounding the interpretive barriers, especially to a non-medievalist. The Roman de la Rose, aside from being difficult to understand, also presents many obstacles to someone trying to wrestle it into an intelligible format for the stage. It contains dozens of characters of varying literary types. The action is intermittent and frequently halted to accommodate spiraling digressions. And the ostensible protagonist has a quest which is both impossible to present literally, a man seeking to consummate his love for a flower, and metaphorically distasteful, ending as it does in what reads today as an act of sexual violence. And yet, how this work vibrates. I first encountered the Roman de la Rose as a graduate student in 2011 when I took a course on the music of Michaud and knew instantly that I had to return to it. I can't share any music from the opera as it's underway, but I can talk briefly about the libretto, which I finished, and I'd be happy to talk more and learn more about it from anyone. It took many months of reading, research, and abandoned drafts to begin circling toward a viable form for this opera. Eventually, I realized that my process would not be to try and update the existing material, like in Ipsa Dixit, nor to populate the world with new characters, like in Here Be Sirens, but to carve out, from within the universe of the text, a new story with new interactions and a new context. My main characters are people familiar with the Roman de la Rose? Probably this a little bit. Well, I'll just talk about it briefly. My main characters are the God of Love, Lady Reason, Shame, the Lover, and False Seeming, with brief appearances by Evil Tongue, Pleasure, and Idleness. The rose is a voiceless and inanimate object throughout, a rose. For each main character, I am attempting to create a sort of allegory of language, a way in which they are characterized musically and literarily, that will allow them to evolve, corrupt, and split open as they do in the original. The God of Love is the only character who sings from the poem itself, in the original Old French, in a rich and romantic musical language. Lady Reason exists in a contemporary incarnation as someone in possession of the facts regarding the neurological basis for our susceptibility to love and to music, and she sings in a functional tonal language. Shame, already a somewhat modern concept, replaces Rebuff as the main antagonist with the sharp wailing voice of contemporary extended techniques and sings primarily texts by contemporary and modern poets like Sylvia Plath, Jory Graham, and Allen Ginsberg. The Lover is presented as a volunteer from the audience, a straight man, played by a woman in Act 1, and when that lover abdicates, a man in Act 2. Finally, False Seeming operates as the master of ceremonies, instigating all the action and interacting with both the characters and the audience, though not revealing his true nature until late. As in the original, these characters belie their sturdy allegorical forms. Lady Reason becomes obsessed with the lover, the God of Love turns bloodthirsty, Shame grows skeptical of her prescribed villainy, and as they transform, the characters take on one another's archetypal, musical, and linguistic profiles. Lady Reason begins to sound like the God of Love, who begins to sound like Shame, who begins to sound like Lady Reason. Some events which occur in Le Roman occur in the opera. It is framed as a dream. The lover is shot with 5 arrows by the God of Love. The mirror of Narcissus is the treacherous portal through which the love object is glimpsed. Other aspects are changed or altered or combined. False Seeming takes on the characters of both Fair Welcome and Friend in disguise. Evil Tongue is feared by the allegorical characters and slain by False Seeming, not because of his malicious gossip, but because he threatens to expose the fantasy within which opera, and perhaps music, and perhaps love, operate. The opera ends not with a triumph by the lover, but with false seeming as the only character it left alive, and his triumphant denial of our capacity for self-knowledge and our ability to locate truth under any circumstances. In an epilogue, the two lovers sit on stage without music or artifice, reading the Roman de la Rose. I am constantly aware that I am writing only one of the hundreds of operas that could be created using the Roman de la Rose as source material. And writing it has so far left me with more questions than answers. In that sense, if only in that sense, I hope my adaptation will resonate with its source. Thank you. So I'm not sure if we have time for questions or do we need to.
Maybe like 5 minutes. Like you really have. But it's frustrating.
I have a question. Yes. What's the role of Rihanna?
Rihanna, well, this is sort of the images that I've been collecting, as I often do when I'm looking at a new opera, and the way that she presents herself as a singer, and particularly the way her fashion intersects with fantasy, is just something that really interests me. So I love this picture of her from a W magazine costume. And actually that top right is also Rihanna from the Met Gala in 2017 this year, when she was dressed in a way that immediately reminded me of the god of love, who is described as just being this kind of walking garden. So she's just sort of a visual inspiration for me.
But to my second question, is there a reflection in your work on the idea of performing a Greco-Roman heritage in a North American context?
I'm not sure. Can you tell me more about, tell me more about what you mean?
So when we choose as European descendants to perform a Greco-Roman heritage in the 21st century, it might or might not have a connotation. And I'd like to know if it's part of your reflection or just enjoy this particular civilization.
Well, I think in terms of setting the Plato dialogue and the Aristotle, it is something that I've approached just from my own kind of limited context and think about how I relate intellectually. I'm trying as much as I can to understand the context in which it was created, and I don't know, being aware that I'm approaching it from a perspective which is totally different and perhaps unrelated, basically means that I'm sort of writing a new version of it, based more on just kind of my experiences.
Any other question? Je peux sans doute poser vos questions en français et
Essayer.
Have you seen La Belle et la Bête? No, pas La Belle et la Bête. Rodin, with the rose.
I don't think so.
That will give you a helpful visual.
I would love to know more about that.
In donkey skin. So how it's translated, like saying much more seen in English in French. It's really, totally bonkers. Jacques Demy movie that's partly sung. It's when, Catherine Deneuve sings about making a cake.
Okay.
I'm not now going to burst into it, but
feel free.
Yeah. And there's an amazing scene when she's walking in her donkey skin because, she's trying to evade her incestuous desiring father. She walks through I think it's a forest, and there's a rose that turns into a mouth halfway through in a really lovely moment of pre-CGI. The right word. And it's a really, I was just thinking it does crazy rose image meets mad technicolor a la Barabichapur kind of technicolor, and with this really striking rose that might give you another image to go on your
great. Yes.
thing.
Yeah. I don't know it, but
I think it would be a fun I mean, it's a really fun thing to watch. I think that's really my only point.
Yeah.
And it has a rose in it and some singing. So,
Yeah, all right.
maybe
Give you the citation.
Cette recommandation cinématographique. Recommandez tous, c'est sympa. On pourra continuer la discussion autour du banquet. Donc, vous êtes tous au Soper. Vous avez l'adresse sur le plan qu'on vous a donné. Et c'est à 19h. Donc, si vous voulez passer à votre hôtel, un peu de temps, mais. Voilà, 19h.
Il y avait un plan.
Rachel,
Oui.
alors, pas de Rachel, les
No, I just, no. Oh, okay. Wait, like, Okay.
Je ne veux pas l'appeler via Skype.
Okay. Yeah, I think I remember that. So she, okay, he decides, she says you have to marry someone just as beautiful as you. Right. Right. I remember this story, but I had no idea somebody made it into a movie.
Non, mais c'est la question. C'est la question, c'est très juste comme question. Je pense que c'est ce qu'il faut penser. En même temps, moi je me retrouve toujours dans cette. En fait, la dialectique a été presque essentialisée, ontologisée dans les années 90, où avec tout le mythe de la réalité virtuelle, avec cette opposition forte entre numérique et non numérique. Et en fait, c'est ça.
Really excited. I hope it's on Netflix.
Par contre, évidemment, quand on parle de contextualisation numérique, c'est ça que j'évoquais. Je pense qu'à l'époque, il fallait penser. Mais là, c'est pour ça que je disais, Mathieu, c'est pas d'accord avec moi, parce que tout le travail que tu as fait sur la contextualisation des archives allait dans ce sens-là, de dire, OK, bah, tu les prends d'un milieu qui est pas numérique, tu les mets dans un milieu numérique, et là, les sens changent. C'était avec moi que vous vouliez parler, oui. Ouais. C'est ce que alors attendez que j'ai oublié qu'on est en train d'enregistrer en fait.